When I was growing up, I was initially being raised by teenage parents. My mom got pregnant with me when she was 15. My dad was also in high school, and they got married right away. So my mom and dad both dropped out of high school. My dad took the first job that he could get. My mom stayed home to raise me. 18 months later, my brother was born. So you can imagine two teenage parents, both high school dropouts, with two kids under two, living off of one income. You can imagine what things were like growing up. I still remember we were on different like government programs and social programs, and we would have cans of Ensure in large cases dropped off at our front door. And I remember my mom would tell me to go out, grab the Ensure, put it back in. Like our refrigerator always had Ensure in it. Can't even smell the stuff anymore. Like it disgusts me to this day because I was just always drinking. Mom was like, "Get your vitamins, drink your Ensure." People don't always believe me when I tell them this. We still had a milkman. I remember getting ready for school in like second, third grade maybe, and early in the morning, my mom would be like, "Austin, get the milk off the front porch and put it in the fridge." Like we were on so many things that like government programs were just dropping stuff off at our door. And again, two kids under two. My mom, by that time, would have been, when my brother came along, 16 or 17. My dad was moving furniture for Globe Furniture, making $8 an hour. A few years later, my sister came along. Now, my dad was the hardest working person I've ever met in my life. I'd never seen him take a sick day. He got a different job. He worked his way up, and I remember a forklift actually tipped over, fell on his foot, crushed his foot, and he was back at work the next day. It was just the kind of guy that he was. And now that it's been years later, my parents kind of worked themselves out of that. They both went back to school. My mom ended up going to college for a little bit. They got their GEDs, again, kind of moved up. And now looking back, my parents can, of course, you don't burden your kids with your financial problems, right? But as adults, my parents now, like they're willing to talk about it a little more about what they went through and the sacrifices they made. And they would tell us things like when we were growing up and playing baseball or playing sports or whatever, my parents would pay half of an electric bill to keep the lights on so then they could take the rest of the money and sign us up for baseball or something. Or they would pay half of another bill, and then they would use that money to buy us cleats or to buy us a bat or something like that. And I remember when I was in fifth grade, I got asked to play on this travel baseball team. It was fifth, sixth, maybe seventh grade. And the guy came over, and he was talking to my dad and I, and he said, we're starting this new team next year. We'd really like him to play for us. It's going to be about, I can't remember, we're just going to say $1,000. It's going to be $1,000, and there's going to be a lot of travel involved and things like that. And I remember hearing that and wanting so bad to play for that team, but not even asking. So it's like, my parents aren't going to pay for that. And then about a week or two later, my dad came and said, "Hey, do you want to play for that team?" He said, "I called the coach. You're on the team." And I was just like floored. Like, you're paying for me to play on this baseball team. Like, I didn't know how bad we had it. I knew we didn't have a lot of money, so I just kind of knew not, like you start to recognize things, so you just know not to ask for things. And so my dad paid for me to be on that baseball team. And then to be on this team, you had to have a certain kind of bat. You couldn't just use any bat. You had to have a certain kind of bat with like a certain stamp on it, and the bats were like $300. Now every bat is $300. It's crazy. My son's 11, he's playing, and his bat, I'm like, why? I don't understand. Like, does this improve a swing? Does this guarantee high batting average and home runs? Because if not, why are we paying this much? But back then, in 1998, 99, 2000, whatever it was, $300 for a bat was unheard of. We ended up finding a cheaper one. It was about half the price. It was about $150, $170, and my dad got me that bat. But then 2 days later, my dad pulled up in front of the house in his work van. He got home from work, and when he got out of work, or when he got out of his van, he had this new bat in his hand. He had the bat that I really wanted, but I wasn't going to ask for it because I knew how expensive it was. And he brought it in, and he handed it to me, and I just saw my mom's eyes like, "What did you do? We just paid for him to be on this team. We already got him one bat, and you bought him another bat?" And he just looked at me and said, "Here you go," smiled and shrugged. And like, I still think about that. And the question becomes, when you see that and you understand kind of the financial situation, $1,000 to be on a baseball team and then a $300 bat, that's an extravagant expense. So the question is it worth it? The question is, was that worth it? To my dad, because my dad loved me and my dad sacrificed for me and my dad wanted that for me, to him, it was absolutely worth it. He was happy to do it. But still, the question of the expense is there. About 6 months ago, I got into woodworking. I don't really know how it happened. I think I just saw an Instagram reel and was like, I'm doing that. And so I started getting into woodworking. I went out and I bought one tool. I can't remember the first tool I bought. I think it was the jigsaw. So I went out and I bought this tool. If you know anything about like new hobbies when you get into, you can get in real quick, real fast. And if you know anything about woodworking or just tools in general, you know you need more than one tool. You need more than a saw to make stuff. Like, you can't just cut stuff. You also have to put it back together, right? And so I bought the jigsaw, and then I bought a sander, and then I was like, all right, my little cash stash that I have hidden in my closet is draining really quick. How am I going to get all these tools? And so then Facebook Marketplace, right? So Facebook Marketplace went on, got a bunch of stuff, and I have all these tools. I'm standing in my garage, breathing in sawdust. Sawdust is everywhere, and I'm standing there looking at this one cutting board I made, surrounded by these hundreds of dollars of tools, and I'm like, whew, was this worth it? Like, I don't know. Well, eventually, I made several cutting boards, and you'll be happy to know, to this point, I've sold 2 cutting boards. I've made like $40. So if you're speaking strictly monetarily, no, it absolutely was not worth it. But I still have all these tools. Who knows? I might start making woodworking videos someday soon, too. It may have been worth it at some point. Right now, I'm going to say no. But someday, maybe it all was worth it. Perhaps you want to go on a vacation. You want to go somewhere you've never been before. You want to see something you've never seen. You want to experience something or do something that you've never done. And you're like, I just can't get my mind around the expense of it. Like, I want to go do this thing. I want to go to this place. Let's say you want to go to Italy. You want to go to Europe. You want to do the European tour. You want to backpack, whatever it is. You want to do this, but you're like, it just costs so much. And to do it, you're like, you know what? I'm not going to drain my savings. I'm going to put it on the credit card, and then I'll just pay for it over time. The question becomes, is it worth it? It's an extravagant expense. Is it worth it to you? So is it worth it? And not only is it worth it, but how do you know? How do you know if something is worth it or not? When it comes to travel, this is just a little side note. I had a friend tell me one time, he was like, I've regretted buying things. I've never regretted taking a vacation and the money I've spent there. And so then I tried applying that, and I was like, you know what? That actually is true, except my vacations are a little cheaper than yours. But it's true. Like, I've never regretted going on a vacation. But there's still that tension between, is it worth it? I want to do this. What's responsible? What's good stewardship? What is all this? And how do you know? As we get into our text today, we're going to see a scenario play out like this right in front of us. And we're going to be confronted, again, with one main question. What is Jesus worth to you? If you have your Bibles, open up to Mark chapter 14 as we continue in Mark. And we're going to be faced with that question. What is Jesus worth to you? It's one of those questions that when we say, hey, what is Jesus worth to you? It's very easy to say everything, right? Jesus is worth everything, because how do you say that, oh, well, how do you put a value on that? Say Jesus is worth everything. He's worth my life. He's everything to me. But practically, though, how is that lived out? How does that play out in your life? And how do you know? Is there something in your life that you are still holding back from him? Is there a point in your giving to Jesus, in your surrender, in your submission, in your life to him? Is there something that you hit and you say, all right, Jesus, that's enough, no more? What is Jesus worth to you? Let's pray as we get into the word one more time. So, Father, as we open your word today, I pray that you would engage our hearts, capture our minds, and let us be locked in and focused on what you have for us today. God, as we consider your worth in our lives, I pray that we would take what we see from your word today, see this act of extravagant worship. Lord, let it challenge us in how we respond to you when we see you. Lord, be with us today. It's your name we pray. Amen. So our text for today, if you grew up in church, it's somewhat of a familiar text. I wouldn't say it's controversial. I would say, though, it at least, it piques your curiosity. You might ask a question like, why would she do that? Mark chapter 14, verses 1 through 11, beginning in verse 1. It was now 2 days after the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar of the people. So this is Passover week. It's the celebration of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The chief priests, this is the religious elite, the scribes, they want to kill Jesus. This holiday, though, where they're at in Jerusalem, where they're celebrating, this is the most significant celebration and holiday for the Jewish people. It was a commemoration of what Jesus had done 1,400 years earlier in rescuing and redeeming his people from Egyptian slavery. So if you remember this story from Exodus, the Israelites were slaves to the Egyptians. God told Pharaoh to let his people go. He sent Moses. Pharaoh refused. So then the Lord began sending a series of plagues. Pharaoh kept rejecting. I'm not letting your people go. Then it got to the 10th plague, and God told the Israelites on that night, the night of the last plague, he said, I want every family to sacrifice a lamb and then take the blood of that lamb, put it across the doorposts of your house. And that night, the Lord passed through Egypt, and he took the life of the firstborn in every house, except for the houses whose doors were covered by the blood of the lamb. He preserved those lives because they were protected and sealed by the sacrifice that God had for them. And so then every year, the Jewish people would come back into Jerusalem and they would celebrate what God had done for them, how he freed them from slavery, how he redeemed them. And they would do this every year back in Jerusalem at the temple. So this would be a massive crowd. This week in Cincinnati, it's opening day. I don't like crowds, but guess what? I love opening day more than I hate crowds, so I'm going to be there. If you've ever been to opening day down at the banks in between the stadium and the restaurants and stuff, it is impossible to move. It is shoulder to shoulder. It is an absolute nightmare if you don't like being around crowds. But I take my son every year, so we're going. That's kind of what it would have been like in Jerusalem at this point. The population would swell up to 3 to 5 times its normal population because everybody's coming back. So take opening day, everybody downtown being very close together all the time, but then extend it for a week. So you're there all week, nobody's taking showers, you're camping out, you're around animals and livestock all the time. So this is where they are right now. This is Jerusalem, stinky, smelly, all these people, everybody's there, and Jesus is there, and the chief priests, the scribes, they want to get to Jesus and they want to kill him. During this week, Jesus has already started just causing controversy. He's already started an uproar. He walked in, and the first day he was there, the second day he was there after coming in, he started flipping tables and chasing people out of the temple with a whip. He started to get the attention of the religious leaders, and they wanted him gone. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish religious elite, the leaders, this is the high court, they wanted to kill him, but they wouldn't do it when everyone is around because Jesus started getting the attention of the people. People started coming into the temple during this week to see Jesus, to see what he was going to do today. He was an attraction. Remember, they weren't walking around on phones and iPads, and they can't just sit in their little tent or their wagon and watch shows. What did they do for entertainment? We're going to go see what Jesus is going to do today. So all these people are there. Jesus is getting their attention. The Sanhedrin, they want to get rid of him, but they know they can't do it when all the people are there. Because if they do it then, all the people are going to rebel. They're going to revolt. They're going to get mad at us, and we can't have that happen. Skip down to verse 10 for me. So in verse 2, they want to get rid of him, but not during the feast because there would be an uproar from the people. But then in verse 10, then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him. So this was their end. We know they want to kill him. We know they don't want to do it when all the people are around. But then Judas comes to the Sanhedrin and he approaches them and says, I'll betray Jesus to you. I'll tell you where he is. I'll turn him in. I'll hand him over. Just give me a little bit of money. And they were happy about it. This is how they would get Jesus, an insider. One of Jesus' own disciples would tell him where to find him, and then he would hand him over. But in the middle of these verses, we get another story. There's a flashback, and this is something that happened about a week before. This is what is kind of called a textual sandwich. This was a way that Mark would write, that he would use it to help make a point and to drive it home. He starts telling story number 1. So he starts in verses 1 and 2, telling the Sanhedrin they want to kill Jesus. And he stops. Doesn't go anywhere there. And he closes it with, but Judas is going to betray Jesus, and that's how they're going to get him. But in the middle, he tells another story. And he does this to make us aware of a significant truth. So just reading the verses 1 through 11, you see this kind of break in the story that Mark was telling, and you're like, those stories kind of seem irrelevant to one another. But Mark does this because he's showing us that these stories are inextricably linked. So if verses 1 and 2 are the first piece of bread, verses 10 and 11 are the second piece of bread. The verses 3 through 9, that's the meat in the middle. Or for my vegetarians, that's your peanut butter and jelly. Verses 3 through 9 are the peanut butter and jelly for the point that Mark is trying to make here. And what we're going to see here is this account of a woman and her act of extravagant worship. Verse 3, and while he, talking of Jesus, was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, pause. Many people think this would have been a party. Bethany is where Lazarus was from. It's where Lazarus lived. And remember, Jesus was a friend of Lazarus. Lazarus died. This is where we get the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Why did Jesus weep? Because his friend had died. And so then what did Jesus do? Jesus raised him from the dead. Lazarus come out. Lazarus comes out. So maybe they're at this house celebrating the fact that Lazarus is alive. But we also see that this party is being held at the house of Simon the leper. Well, somebody that had leprosy wasn't allowed to be around people. They were unclean. They couldn't host people. Nobody else would have been around them. It would have been forbidden. Everybody else would have wanted to stay away anyway. So the fact that this guy's hosting the party tells us that he doesn't have leprosy, but we can safely infer that he used to have leprosy. Maybe they are there celebrating at this dinner party because Jesus healed Simon the leper. So we can call him Simon the former leper. So they're at this dinner party, and as they're at this dinner party, Jesus there, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii. I know we don't know how much that is. We're going to get to that later. This could have been sold for over 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they scolded her. But Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly, I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. So this woman who we know from John, in the same account, we know this is Mary. Not Mary, the mother of Jesus, but Mary, the follower of Jesus. She interrupts dinner. She breaks this flask of perfume and pours it on Jesus. And the disciples who were there, they witness this, and they get angry because they think it's a waste. But Jesus had a very different reaction. Jesus said what she did was beautiful. In Jesus' words in verse 9, when he says, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Those words of Jesus are being proven true right now, this morning, 2,000 years later, and we're talking about what she did. Jesus said people are going to talk about this forever, and that's what we're doing today. But one thing that we can be sure of when we see this is we see the reaction of the disciples and we see the reaction of Jesus. And one thing that we can absolutely be sure of is that when we think of something differently than Jesus does, we're the ones in the wrong, not him. We're the ones who aren't seeing things correctly. If Jesus sees something and says, this is good and this is beautiful, and we have trouble seeing it, it's not because Jesus is wrong. It's because there's something within us that doesn't see what Jesus sees. But Jesus takes this act of the woman and says, this is beautiful. And after seeing what this woman does, this is where we come back to that same question that the text confronts us with. Was it worth it? Was Jesus worth it? Was what she did to him worth it? And what is he worth to you? As we get into this, we're going to see, I think the first truth that we see is this. Your life declares the glory of something. Your life declares the glory of something. Look at verse 1. The chief priests and the scribes, they were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. They wanted him gone. Why did they want to kill him? Because Jesus, he was popular with the people. The people were starting to listen to him, and Jesus was a threat to their glory. They needed to get rid of Jesus in order to protect their self-glory and have and self-preservation. As long as Jesus is around, he is a threat to the influence and the power that we have over the people here. We need him gone. But they weren't the only ones that wanted Jesus out of the way. They weren't the only ones that valued something more than Jesus. Judas did too. But Judas' price was even cheaper, 30 pieces of silver. Judas just needed Jesus out of the way so that he can get rid of money. So both of them together, if we get rid of Jesus, then we all get something that we truly value, right? Judas, you get the money. We get to keep our power. We just need to get Jesus out of the way. And just like them, our lives declare the glory of something. Our lives declare the glory of something. There is something of the highest value in our lives that we want more than anything else. It's not a question of if, it's a question of what. You are going to worship. You're going to have something as the highest value in your life. You were created as a worshiper. You're going to worship something. And if you're not worshiping God, you're worshiping something else. It's a cheap substitute. And it can be anything. For many, it's career. We want and we need the security of a good career and the stability that it provides, or we want to be seen as achieving and as successful. When people look at us, we want them to see like, man, he is a hard worker. He's got it figured out. Or, man, she is excelling. She's doing incredible. We want that more than anything. For some, it's even simpler. It's just money. Just get all that we can because money is our sense of security. It gives us access to what we want. It gives us access to do just hobbies, go on trips, to do the things that we want to do. It gives us access to acquire the things that we want most. For others, it's our kids. Like, we won't let anything get in the way of making our kids the primary object of our affection. We give them everything. We want them to have everything. We put them on display. We blast their achievements on Facebook and Instagram. We want everybody to know how great they're doing all the time in sports and in school. Like, that's what we want people to see the most when they look at us. Look how great my kids are. If my kids are this great, I must be killing it as a parent. Now look, it's not a bad thing to take pride in your kids. Easton's first baseball game is this afternoon. I promise you, if he cranks one over the fence, you're going to hear about it. It's going to happen, right? It's not a bad thing to take pride in your kids. Listen, you should. Take pride in your career. Take pride in wise decisions. Take pride in your children. That's not a bad thing. Sacrificing for them, like my dad did for me, it's not a bad thing. Those are good things that good parents do. But a good career, a good financial situation, your beautiful kids, those are all blessings from God that become idols when they become the primary object of our affections. When they replace God in our lives, they've become an idol and they become the object of our primary object of our worship. And just like Judas and just like the chief priests, we can be guilty of treating Jesus the same way they did. We desire something. We want to go after something. We need, or we think we need something, that our life isn't going to be satisfied and fulfilling without this thing, but Jesus is in our way. We just need to push him aside or ignore him or put him on the side of our mind so that we can go after this thing that we really want. But I'm telling you, the gospel makes something absolutely clear. Jesus isn't in our way. Jesus is our way. He is what we are supposed to surrender our entire lives around. He is the center of our lives around which everything else revolves. So what do people see when they look at you? What do you want them to see? When you examine your own heart, when you do some honest self-evaluation, what does your heart want most? Is your life spent in pursuit of something other than Jesus? Because your life declares the glory of something. What is it? For Jesus followers, we are called to live very different lives. We are called to live lives that declare the glory of Jesus. And a life that is fully surrendered to him will. A life surrendered to Jesus is one that recognizes and responds to his glory. Judas was one of the 12. He was in close proximity to Jesus, but he didn't worship him. He was so close, but he missed him. Judas couldn't see past his greed to see the true worth of Jesus. The Sanhedrin, they couldn't see past their lust for power to see the true worth of Jesus. Those who don't see Jesus for who he truly is miss his worth. But one woman who saw Jesus' true worth, she didn't just recognize it, but she responded and she declared it with her life in an act of incredible worship. My son, he loves the show Pawn Stars. I love that show too. It's a show that we can watch together, and it's just so intriguing. I love history anyway, so when people bring in old things and they tell the stories about them, I love it. And so people will bring in these most unique or these strange items into the pawn shop, and they'll start telling the story about it, and you get the background and how they acquired it, and then they'll bring in an expert who tell you even more about it, and it's fascinating to me. And so you start to learn about all these items, but as you're watching it, we all know, there's only one question we have on our minds the whole time. What's that question? How much is it worth? Yeah, it's a cool item. How much is it worth, though? Some people bring in things that just because it's very important to them and it's some sort of family heirloom or they think it's super valuable, they'll bring it in and, hey, because it's important to me, this should be worth a lot of money. And then they get upset when what they believe it's worth doesn't fully reflect its value, right? But then there's other things that are just seemingly garbage, just trash, or something somebody picked up at a yard sale and they bring it in and it's worth thousands of dollars. We're watching it one time, and there was this guy who went to a yard sale, and he saw this very ornate Polish, military medal that's given. And come to find out, it was essentially like America here, the Medal of Honor. It was like their Medal of Honor. It was this beautiful medal, very heavy, very detailed, intricate. It was old. This guy found it, bought it at a yard sale for 75 cents. Took it to the pawn shop. And upon taking it there, selling it, and having it appraised, it ended up being worth $40,000. So now every time I see a yard sale, I'm like, there's a hidden treasure there somewhere. There is something there that is going to pay for the cruise I want to go. There's something there. I think of that hidden treasure that's there at that yard sale. But so when I see that, I think about that guy. I see a yard sale and I'm like, remember that guy that bought a medal for 75 cents and it was worth $40,000? But I don't just think about him. I don't just think about the guy that made the purchase. I also think about the guy who was having the yard sale. This guy that was having the yard sale had this medal, had no idea what he had, and let it go for 75 cents. Judas had no idea what he had, and he let it go for 30 pieces of silver. Then I also think about all the other people at the yard sale who came and bought things, and they just walked by it. They saw it, let it go by, didn't even give it a second glance, didn't buy it, saw that it was 75 cents, like, I'm not buying that thing. The medal was sitting right there. Anyone could have picked it up and taken it, but they didn't recognize its worth. But one man saw it, recognized its value, and he responded. At this dinner party, there are people sitting around this table with Jesus. They don't see his value. Judas traveled with Jesus for 3 years. All the people in the temple who had heard Jesus teach and saw him perform miracles, they all missed him. They walked right by. They didn't recognize his glory except for Mary. Mary saw and she responded, and that should be true of every Jesus follower, that we recognize and we respond to the worth of Jesus with our worship. We see what others miss. Just like the people in that yard sale who walked right by the medal, people pass by Jesus all the time and don't see his glory. They don't see his value. And that's where we come in. Our lives are to declare the glory of Jesus. That's what this story tells us. This story tells us something, that your life is not about your glory. It's not about me. It's not about us. It's not about drawing attention to something that I've achieved, something I can take pride in, something that I can do. But my life is to be leveraged for the gospel and to declare the glory of Jesus because he is worth it. That's what my life is about. And when we see these accounts, the one of Judas and the Sanhedrin and their response to Jesus, in contrast to Mary's response to Jesus, we should ask ourselves, in this narrative, which category do I fall into? Is Jesus in my way, or is he worthy of all of my worship? Am I like Mary who responds to the worth of Jesus, or am I more like these others who just need to get Jesus out of the way so I can go after what I really want? Like, how often are we so close to Jesus and we miss worshiping him? How many people do you know that have been to church, that have heard the gospel, and yet they still miss Jesus? And when you recognize and you respond to the glory of Jesus, not only does it change how you value Jesus, but it changes how you value everything else. Look in verse 3. With an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, that means furious. They were irate. They weren't just a little, why did you do that? No, they were infuriated that Mary did this. Why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor, and they scolded her. If you've ever been scolded, you know it's a little different than somebody just like, I didn't like that you did that. Like, they were furious that she did this. Here's what we see here. Lives declaring the worth of Jesus will be criticized. If your life is fully declaring the glory and the worth of Jesus, you will be criticized. This ointment, it was an aromatic oil. It was a very expensive perfume. Now, Mary, she wasn't a woman of means. She didn't have a lot. This flask of oil was likely the most expensive thing that she owned. It says it was worth 300 denarii. So 1 denarius was considered to be 1 day's wage. So 300 denarii, this is 1 year's worth of pay. A full year's salary. This was likely a family heirloom that was passed down to her. This was her nest egg. This was her sense of security. This isn't just a decoration that she had, but this was the security of the financial stability of her life. If everything crashed, if she lost it all, if the stock market at the Jerusalem temple took a nosedive, she was going to be okay because she had this flask of oil that she could survive by either selling the whole thing or a little bit at a time to keep making ends meet. But that's not what she did. Imagine your entire year's salary given to Jesus in one incredible act of worship. Like, we even see that and we're like, whoa, I don't know about, like, that's a little much, right? That's something in us that is preventing us from seeing what Jesus saw when he called it beautiful. There were some there who we saw were indignant. Who were they? Well, John chapter 12, in the same account of this, or in the account of this story over in the book of John, tells us that the leader of this infuriated party was Judas, the one who was eventually going to betray. He said, "Why did you do that? That could have been sold and that money given to the poor." But John tells us that wasn't actually Judas's true motive. John chapter 12, verse 6 says, "He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to whatever was put into it." Judas didn't care about the poor. Judas was the treasurer of the disciples. He was stealing money from the disciples' coffer. He was stealing money from Jesus. He wanted to sell it to put that money in there so he could steal more. Yet Judas wasn't the only one that was angry. The other disciples were angry too. Why? Again, because the ointment was so costly, so valuable, so expensive, they believed that it was wasted. And when I was looking at this, this is the realization that I came to this week. The only way the ointment was wasted was if Jesus wasn't worth it. It was only wasted if Jesus wasn't worth what she did. And when Jesus responds that this is beautiful, and he said, "You're always going to have the poor, but you're not always going to have me." He's not dismissing how we should care for the poor. Jesus believed, Jesus taught, Jesus modeled going to and serving the poor. What Jesus is saying, though, the opportunity for Mary to offer Jesus this type of worship and this type of affection would soon be gone. Jesus would not always be there, but she's worshiping while she has the chance. And I want you to notice, she has this whole jar. She could have offered him a little bit. She could have poured a little bit on him, and that would have been an act of worship. She broke the jar. She didn't pour it out. She broke the jar, ensuring that it could never be used again. This was a gift of totality. That what she had, she was giving it all to Jesus, and she was holding nothing back. Think about this. In scolding this woman and being angry at her for this extravagant act of worship, they're also demeaning Jesus at the same time. By getting angry at her, they're saying Jesus wasn't worth that. And we do that too. And if we face that too. Like we get accused and encountered that a lot. Jesus is worth a lot, but he's not worth that much, right? We love the idea of extravagance. And everything else, we're cool with extravagance. You want money? Get all the money that you possibly can. You can never have too much money, right? Just go get it all. In your career, be as successful as you possibly can. Put in the work, grind, do what you have to do to climb that corporate ladder. Academic, get the best grades that you can. Get everything, be as great as you can at everything in life. Happiness, do whatever makes you happy. Achieve the ultimate happiness at whatever cost. Go party, go achieve, go have all the sex. Get whatever you want to do. Go do it all as long as you're happy, because you can't get excessive with something that you really want. Accept your worship of Jesus. When it comes to religion, when it comes to church, when it comes to Jesus, you need to moderate. Yeah, Jesus is valuable, but don't get excessive with it. If you leave a good career because God's leading you in another direction, you will be looked at as foolish. If you spend your vacation time and money going on a short term mission trip, people are going to be like, you wasted your time off. Why would you do that? If you dedicate time to serving God by going to the poor and to the hurting, people are like, you're idealistic and impractical. If you tithe regularly to the church, people are going to be like, you're financially irresponsible. Sure, love Jesus. I'm happy for you. Get a little bit of Jesus in your life, but don't take it too far. Don't be unreasonable with it. That's the message of the world. That's the message of people who don't see the worth of Jesus. But Jesus says, I am worth everything, and it's beautiful. He is worthy of it all. He is worthy of the totality of our lives. He is worth our extravagant worship. Which brings us back to the question, what is Jesus worth to you? Jesus is worthy of your life. I'm just going to make that statement. Jesus is worthy of your life, not because I think so, but Jesus thinks so. Jesus declared that he is worthy of your full surrender. Jesus declared that he is worthy of your life. So the question is not, is Jesus worth it? The question is, do you agree with him? Do you agree with Jesus that he is worthy of your life? As we close, I'm going to be down front during this last song of worship. And if you don't know what it means to know Jesus, you don't know what it means to have a relationship with Jesus, to surrender your life to Jesus, to live with him at the center of your life, I'm going to be down front. You can come talk to me then. If you don't want to do that, out in the lobby afterwards, you can pull me aside. We can have a conversation. I'd love to have that with you. If you want to set up a time to get together this week, I'd love to do that as well. Let's pray.